Nobody tells you that grief has a smell. They tell you it has stages, that it comes in waves, that it softens with time. But they never tell you that it smells like a particular shirt left unwashed in the back of a closet, or like the old wool jacket hanging by the door that nobody has moved in months, or like the inside of a leather watch box lined in faded blue velvet, the lid still bearing the faint indentation where a watch once rested every single night for nearly 50 years. Nadia Osman was 34 years old when she first opened that box. She had found it at the bottom of her grandfather's wardrobe while helping her mother sort through his things, 3 weeks after the funeral. The wardrobe had been emptied mostly in silence, the two of them folding and stacking with the careful, almost ceremonial movements of people handling something more fragile than fabric. Her mother had not cried. Nadia had not cried either, which surprised her. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something more like pressure, a low, constant weight pressing just below the sternum, as though something large and permanent had settled inside her chest and was still deciding whether to stay. The box was small, the kind jewelers use for larger pieces. She lifted it out and turned it over in her hands, and before she opened it, she already knew what would be inside. She had seen it on his wrist her entire life. The watch was a Seiko automatic, nothing extravagant, with a champagne-colored face and a brown leather strap that had been replaced twice in her lifetime and still carried the particular curvature of a wrist she would never hold again. She lifted it out carefully. It was cold, and it had stopped. She didn't know when it had stopped. Her grandfather, Baba Yusuf, which was what she had called him since she was old enough to form the words, had worn it every day until the last weeks of his illness, when even the slight weight of it on his wrist had become uncomfortable. He had handed it to her mother then, or perhaps placed it on the nightstand himself. Nobody could quite remember the moment it had left his wrist. Those final weeks had a blur to them, a quality like overexposed film. The shapes were there, but the sharp edges had been washed out by the intensity of the light. Nadia turned the watch over. On the back, in letters worn faint by decades of contact with skin, was an inscription in Arabic. Her Arabic was not strong enough to read it fluently, and the engraving was old and soft, but she recognized the word for time. She recognized the word for trust. The rest she carried in her memory to her Uncle Rashid, who read it slowly and then said quietly, "It means, trust time with what you cannot carry alone." She held the watch for the rest of that afternoon and didn't put it down. Baba Yusuf had come to this country with almost nothing. That was the version of the story Nadia had grown up with, and it was true, though like all true stories it was also incomplete. He had come with almost nothing material, but he had brought with him a character that people described, long after first meeting him, as though they were trying to describe a climate rather than a person. Warm, they always said. Patient. The kind of man who made you feel that your problem, whatever it was the most important thing in the room. He had worked as a tailor for 31 years out of a small shop that smelled of pressed fabric and the particular sweetness of a very old steam iron. He had altered wedding dresses and let out the waistbands of old men's trousers and hemmed the school trousers of 3 generations of children in the same neighborhood. He had charged, for as long as anyone could remember, the same modest prices, and when someone came to him with a need that clearly exceeded their means, he had a way of forgetting to charge them at all, or of finding a reason to call the work practice, or a favor. His shop had a small wooden bench outside it on which people sat waiting, and the waiting had never bothered anyone, because the bench was in a good spot for Son, and Baba Yusuf kept a small tin of hard candy on the counter that anyone was free to take from, which meant that the children of the neighborhood treated his doorway as a kind of way station, coming and going with their sweets and their noise, and he had never once minded. He had been, in the truest sense of the phrase, a man who was present wherever he was. This was the thing Nadia kept returning to in the weeks after the funeral, as the pressure in her chest continued its slow residency. She was not a person who was very good at being present. She was a person who was very good at being busy. She worked in digital communications for a company that sent her approximately 200 emails a day. And she was good at her job in the way that people are good at jobs that demand the constant management of urgency, which is to say she had become, over the years, fluent in a kind of productive anxiety, a way of moving through hours that felt like forward motion, but was really just the appearance of it, the scroll and tap and respond and scroll again. The inbox as a tide that could never actually be turned back. She had visited Baba Yusuf often enough, she told herself. She had called on the important days. She had been there at the end, in the final weeks, sitting by his bed with her phone turned face down on the floor beside her, which had felt like a sacrifice at the time, and which now felt like an embarrassingly small thing to have considered a sacrifice. She remembered one particular afternoon in those final weeks. He had been tired, drifting in and out, but in a lucid hour he had asked her what she was thinking about. Not how she was doing, not how work was going, what was she thinking about? It was the kind of question he had always asked, the kind that required an actual answer rather than a social one. And she had paused and realized with a small shock that she wasn't thinking about anything in particular. She was thinking about 17 things in parallel, which is not the same as thinking. She was composing a response to an email she hadn't technically received yet. She was running the mental arithmetic of what time she needed to leave to catch a good train. She was doing what she always did, which was to be slightly elsewhere even when she was somewhere. "You think too fast," he had said, watching her face. "I know," she had said, which was not the same as doing anything about it. "Sit here a minute," he had said, "just here, just this minute." She had sat. She had tried. She had lasted perhaps 4 minutes before her hand moved toward her phone. He had not said anything when she did that. He had simply watched her with the gentle, uncomplicated acceptance of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that the people he loved were imperfect, and loved them in full knowledge of it. She thought about those 4 minutes constantly now. She thought about how she had been given an invitation not metaphorically, but literally, explicitly, by a man running out of afternoons to simply sit beside him. And she had managed 4 minutes. The watch stayed on her bedside table. She didn't wind it or set it. She left it stopped at 3:17, and she wasn't sure why, only that changing it felt like erasing something, like editing a document in a way that couldn't be undone. One evening about 2 months after the funeral, Nadia went to visit her grandmother Teta Salwa, who was 78 and had been married to Baba Yusuf for 51 years, and was conducting her widowhood with a dignity that Nadia found both inspiring and slightly frightening. Teta Salwa had not collapsed. She had not become indefinitely frail. She had done what she had always done, which was to cook for people, because she had understood for 50 years that feeding someone was one of the most fundamental ways you could say, "You matter to me, your body matters, your continuance in the world matters, here is warm food." They sat at the small kitchen table with tea and a plate of the sesame cookies Teta Salwa made from a recipe that predated all of them. Nadia had the watch in her bag. She had started carrying it with her without quite deciding to. She took it out and set it on the table between them. Teta Salwa looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she reached out and laid 2 fingers on it, very lightly, the way you might touch something you weren't sure was entirely real. "He wore it the day we met," she said. "I remember it because I thought it was very elegant for a young man with no money." She smiled at the memory. "He had one good shirt, one good pair of trousers, and this watch. He told me his father had given it to him, and that the inscription meant he should trust time with the things that were too heavy to carry by himself." She was quiet for a moment. "I think it took him many years to actually understand what that meant." "What do you think it meant?" Nadia asked. Her grandmother considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I think it means that not everything can be resolved by trying harder. Some things can only be resolved by living long enough, by continuing, by letting time do the part that you cannot do." She picked up the watch properly then and turned it over, read the inscription with the ease of someone who had read it many hundreds of times. He used to say that patience was not the same as passivity. That waiting was not the same as doing nothing. That sometimes the most honest thing you could say to a problem was, "Not yet. I am not ready yet. I will come back to this when I am more able to carry it." Nadia thought about that. She thought about the email responses she wrote at midnight when she was tired and anxious and not actually thinking clearly. She thought about the decisions she had rushed through not because they required urgency, but because urgency was the only mode she knew. She thought about all the times she had sat with something difficult and tried to resolve it faster than it wanted to be resolved, forcing conclusions that hadn't fully formed yet. The way you might try to open a jar by pulling instead of turning, accomplishing nothing except the burning of your own palms. "He was never in a hurry," Nadia said. "No," said Terasawa, "but he was never idle either. There is a difference between unhurried and unmoving. He was always working, always building, always caring. But he did all of it at the speed that things actually needed to be done, not slower, not faster. He had a very good sense of actual time, not clock time. Actual time," she said. "I keep thinking about an afternoon near the end. He asked me to just sit with him and I lasted 4 minutes before I picked up my phone." Terasawa did not say, "It's all right," he understood. She did not say, "Don't be so hard on yourself." She said nothing for a moment and then she said, "Yes, he told me about that afternoon." Nadia felt that land in her chest. "He wasn't hurt by it," her grandmother continued carefully. "He was sad for you, not for himself. He had made his peace long ago with how much of yourself a person can give at any one time, with how people who are caught in the rush of their lives sometimes can't slow down even when they want to, even when they're trying. He was sad because he could see that you wanted to sit still and you couldn't. He was sad because he loved you and he didn't want you to spend your life unable to sit still." Nadia looked at her hands which were always doing something. Opening apps, typing, swiping, carrying things from one room to another in the service of various urgencies that she could not, if pressed, have fully justified. "He used to say," Terasawa went on, "that the saddest thing about the modern world was not that people were cruel. He didn't think people were particularly cruel. He thought most people were trying their best. The saddest thing," he said, "was that everyone was somewhere else. That even when people were with you, they were partly somewhere else. And he understood why there was so much somewhere else to be, so much pulling at people, but he still thought it was the great loss of the age. The loss of actual presence." Nadia was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the last light of the evening was doing something gold and slow with the tops of the trees. She made herself watch it. She made herself not reach for her phone. "How do I fix it?" she said finally. "How do I learn to just be where I am?" Her grandmother looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts affection and amusement. "The same way you learn anything," she said. "You practice. You fail. You try again. You are kind to yourself about the failing because cruelty is not a good teacher." She poured more tea. "And you remember that presence is not a performance. You do not have to achieve it or demonstrate it. You only have to choose it again and again and again, imperfectly, for the rest of your life." Nadia drove home that night more slowly than she usually did, not because the roads required it, because she was noticing things. The way the streetlights made pools of amber on the wet road, the smell of rain that had come and gone while she was inside, the particular quality of the silence at 9 p.m. on a street where most people are in for the evening, a silence that is different from the silence of early morning or the silence of the very late night, warmer, somehow more inhabited. She had not noticed these things in a long time, not because they had stopped being there, but because she had stopped looking. She placed the watch on her nightstand when she got home, as she had every night since she found it. But this time she lay there in the dark looking at it instead of immediately reaching for her phone. The stopped hands. 3:17. She thought about what her grandmother had said about actual time versus clock time. She thought about Baba Yusuf at his bench outside the shop in the sun, unhurried. She thought about the 4 minutes she had given him when he had asked for just one. She thought he knew. He saw me clearly. He saw my worst, most scattered self, and he loved it without conditions. He wanted better for it, but he loved it without conditions. That, she realized, was what she had been most afraid to face. Not the grief itself, but the compound grief, the grief of the loss folded inside the grief of the unlived moments, the calls she had half made, the visits she had half been on, the afternoons she had spent in the same room as him while actually being somewhere else entirely. She had been afraid to sit with all of that because she didn't know what to do with it. She had no response to send, no task to complete, no urgency to manage. It was simply a weight to be carried, and the only honest thing she could say to it was, "Not yet. I am not ready yet. I will come back to this when I am more able to hold it." She understood now what the inscription meant. Not that time would fix everything, because it wouldn't. Not that time would take the loss away, because it couldn't. But that time was the only medium in which the things too large and too irregular to be resolved quickly could be gently worked with. That grief was not a problem to be solved in a sitting. That guilt, too, had its own slow metabolism. That she could not rush her way through the process of becoming someone who had lost someone important, any more than she could rush a seed into a tree. She could only continue, day after day, choosing to be a little more present than she had been, a little more honest, a little more willing to sit still even when everything in her wanted to move. She started going to Teta Salwa's on Thursday evenings, not for any particular reason other than that she wanted to. They would eat and talk, and sometimes sit in the comfortable silence that two people can share when they are not trying to fill every moment with purpose. She brought the sesame cookie recipe home and practiced making them badly before making them tolerably and eventually making them well. She walked to the tailor's shop one afternoon and stood outside it for a while, looking at the wooden bench, and then sat on it for 20 minutes, which felt both ordinary and enormous. She wound the watch 6 months after she had found it. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with nothing that needed doing, which was itself a new experience, the product of many small, deliberate choices she had been making about what actually needed doing and what was the performance of busyness. She picked up the watch and held it for a moment, and then she turned the crown slowly and felt the resistance of 50 years of good engineering, and then the ease of it engaging, and then the soft rhythm of the movement beginning again, and she held it to her ear and heard it tick. That ancient, small, domestic sound, a heartbeat of sorts, the sound of actual time being measured out, 1 second at a time, without drama. She didn't put it on. It was his watch. But she set it to the right time, and she put it back in its velvet box, and she left the lid open so she could see it. It was still 3:17 somewhere, she thought, the 3:17 where he had last looked at it. That moment was not gone. It was just no longer visible from where she was standing. All the moments were still there, the full sum of him, preserved in the amber of the past where nothing could touch them anymore. The bench in the sun, the tin of candy. The 4 minutes she had managed on a tired afternoon, and the 8 she might have managed if she had tried harder, and the 20 she might manage now, and the full unhurried hours she was slowly, imperfectly learning to give to the people who were still here. She had his patience to learn. She had his sense of actual time to practice. She had his particular understanding, not yet fully her own, that being somewhere meant being all the way somewhere, that a person sitting beside you deserved the whole of you, not the fraction left over after the rest of the world had taken its share. She was still learning. She would probably always be learning. That was all right. He had known that too. Outside the window, the Sunday morning was doing what Sunday mornings do, which is to make the ordinary world look briefly like the world you would choose if you were choosing deliberately. The light was good. The tea was warm. There was nowhere she needed to be in the next hour except exactly where she was. She sat still, and this time she managed more than 4 minutes. She managed the whole morning. There is a particular kind of love that does not announce itself, that does not arrive with ceremony or insist on being recognized. It is the love that keeps a bench in the sun so that people have somewhere to rest. It is the love that feeds you without being asked. It is the love that asks, "What are you thinking about?" and means it. It is the love that says, "Just sit here, just this minute," and waits patiently without keeping score for you to be ready. We do not always know, while we are receiving it, that we are receiving it. We take it in the way we take in air as a given, as the atmosphere, as the thing that is simply there when we need it. And then one day the atmosphere shifts, and we feel for the first time the specific shape of what we had been breathing. The people in your life who have that quality, that steadiness, that unhurried, uncomplaining, open-armed presence, they are giving you something every ordinary day. The phone call you take while half reading a screen. The dinner table you sit at while elsewhere in your mind. The how are you they ask, and you answer briefly because there is somewhere you need to be. Not perfectly. That is not the question. We are all in some way learning. The question is simply whether we are paying attention, whether we are really here at least sometimes, whether we are making the choice, imperfectly but genuinely, to be all the way somewhere with the people who deserve all of us. Trust time with what you cannot carry alone, but do not waste the time you have. Open it, give it. Be in it this minute, this afternoon, this ordinary Sunday, not somewhere else. Here.